Welcome back to Philosophy 333, Epistemology. I'm James Beebe, your instructor at the University at Buffalo. In this presentation, I want to say a few things about fallibilism and infallibilism in epistemology, and what they have to say about rational belief, knowledge, and skepticism. I want to introduce the things that I want to say about fallibilism, infallibilism, and knowledge by starting with a famous dictum, a famous epistemic principle that's most commonly associated with the early modern philosophers John Locke and David Hume. There are many other philosophers who have endorsed this principle that we'll talk about. But it's the names of these two that are most commonly associated with it. And the dictum, maxim, or principle is that you should proportion your degree of belief to the strength of your evidence. So to illustrate this principle that you should proportion your degree of belief to the evidence available, let's consider the following three hypothetical subjects: Jimbo, Dolph, and Kearney. And what I've done here is I've represented two different things for each agent. I've represented the strength of their belief or their degree of confidence with a blue bar, and the strength of their evidence with the blue bar. So by belief or degree of evidence, I mean how confident are they that some proposition is true. So on the y-axis, the y-axis goes all the way to 1, where if their degree of belief went all the way to 1, that would mean that they are totally psychologically, subjectively certain that some proposition is true. They couldn't be any more confident. 1 is an absolute boundary, an absolute extreme boundary. It's the most confidence possible you could have in a belief. So we can see that Jimbo, Dolph, and Kearney each have some degree of confidence that falls short of 1, but in each case it's a good bit above 0 as well. In 2 of the cases it's above 0.5. So the blue bar represents your degree of confidence, all the way from you're not confident at all to meh, 50-50, I don't know, to maximal confidence. Now the red bar represents how strong is their evidence or reasons. So evidence comes in different degrees of strength. You can have absolutely, totally conclusive, convincing proof, or you can have reasons or evidence that are, kind of good, but not, absolutely maximally strong. And then, of course, you can have evidence or reasons that are pretty weak. So with Jimbo, Dolph, and Kearney, we see them each having a degree of belief that's different than in the 3 cases, and also a certain amount of evidence that's different across the 3 cases. But what we see from Jimbo, Dolph, and Kearney is each of them is following the maxim from Locke and Hume. You should proportion your degree of belief to the evidence that is available. So Dolph has the most evidence for the proposition in question. Jimbo and Dolph in particular are inclined to believe that some proposition is true, but Dolph is inclined to believe his proposition is true more strongly. He has a stronger inclination, stronger degree of belief. And that's because Dolph has more evidence. His red bar is higher than Jimbo's red bar. He's got more evidence, and because he's being very rational in this case, he follows that evidence where it leads, and it leads him to a stronger degree of evidence, a stronger degree of belief. Jimbo is also following his evidence where it leads, but because his evidence is less strong, he rationally lets his degree of confidence in the truth of the proposition be less strong. And similarly for Kearney, Kearney recognizes his evidence is even weaker than that possessed by Jimbo and Dolph, and so he lets his degree of belief follow his evidence accordingly. Now let's consider what would happen if these 3 guys stopped following Locke and Hume's maxim. So in the first scenario, let's think about Jimbo. So in this case, we have a degree of belief that's pretty strong. It's up there, getting close to 1. But his degree of evidence is pretty low. In other words, he's pretty confident that something is true, but he doesn't have the evidence or reasons to back up his confidence. And Locke and Hume claim that that's what irrational, unjustified belief is all about. You believe something more strongly than you should. And the should part concerns your evidence. You believe something more strongly than your evidence says it's okay for you to believe. In the previous version of Jimbo, Dolph, and Kearney's beliefs, they were all following their evidence. Jimbo's not following it here. And Locke, Hume, René Descartes, and many other philosophers have thought that this situation depicted here with Jimbo is the human condition. We let our beliefs outrun our evidence. We believe things more strongly than we should. Descartes in particular, I forget whether this is in his Rules for the Direction of the Mind or his Discourse on Method. I didn't think it was in the Meditations, his most famous work. But Descartes says that the problem with human rationality lies in the will. Our decisions. We decide to believe something more strongly than our reason can recognize that we should be believing. Now, belief and evidence can come apart in another direction as well, and that's what we have represented here with Dolph. He's got a pretty decent amount of evidence in favor of some proposition, but he doesn't believe it very strongly. His degree of belief is falling behind, lagging behind his evidence. In class, when I ask students what kind of belief this makes them think of, the most common answer I get is one concerning global warming. So global warming skeptics are like this. The amount of evidence out there that increases in average global temperature across decades is human-caused. That's the proposition, complex proposition. Anthropogenic global warming. There's a lot of evidence for that, but the skeptics, their degree of belief trails behind. In principle, the two kinds of beliefs of Jimbo and Dolph are they're really not two distinct classes of things. They're both cases where people aren't following the evidence where it leads. They're believing what they want to believe. They're not believing in accordance with the evidence. So in any case, you kind of see what Locke and Hume's maxim is all about. The maxim says they should always be equal, your degree of belief and the strength of your evidence. You got a lot of evidence, well then you should have a strong degree of belief. You got weak evidence, you should have a weak degree of belief. If your evidence is totally absent or totally even Steven for and against some proposition, then you should be totally agnostic. If your evidence is agnostic and neutral between two propositions, the truth or the falsity of a proposition, then you should be equally agnostic. You should follow or proportion your degree of belief to the amount of evidence available. So that's their maxim. Now I believe that René Descartes also endorsed this maxim, although he's not ever associated with it. I think you will find exactly 0 references on the internet saying that Descartes bought this sort of maxim, but I think he quite clearly did. I want to introduce Descartes at this point to talk about fallibilism and infallibilism, and I'm going to use the same kinds of bars that I used to illustrate Locke and Hume's maxim to talk about fallibilism and infallibilism and the alleged infallibilism of René Descartes. So, René Descartes, in his most famous work from 1641, Meditations on First Philosophy, he writes about scientia. Usually, people just say Descartes writing about knowledge. And it's commonly said that for Descartes, Descartes was an infallibilist. Descartes claimed that in order to know something, certainty was required. Certainty in both senses. So in our reading assignment from Stephen Hetherington on Fallibilism from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and also in the article on certainty from Baron Reed from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, they both distinguish between the epistemic side, which is in red, and the more subjective psychological side, which is in blue. The blue is how subjectively confident are you, and the blue is, okay, how much is that confidence actually warranted, justified, made rational by your evidence? The epistemic, the epistemological stuff's the red part, and the fact and the question of whether the blue and the red match. That's an epistemological question as well. In any case, in the Meditations on First Philosophy, I don't believe that Descartes was talking about what the average French person on the streets in 1641 thought that the French verb savoir, to know, properly applied to. I don't think for a minute Descartes was sitting down to say, I'm going to explicate the ordinary concept of knowledge as it appears here in early 17th century France. What does the average person think counts as a genuine case of knowledge? He's not concerned with ordinary beliefs, ordinary knowledge. He quite clearly states that he's concerned with this very specific thing, scientia, a label that's been used since it's from what we, of course, we get our term science, but it's a special kind of high-grade knowledge. First, this kind of notion of scientia, I think, was first articulated in the West by Aristotle in his book, The Posterior Analytics, which is not widely read, and I don't actually recommend reading it one bit. But Aristotle sat down to articulate what does the highest form of knowledge look like, and what would it require? And I believe that's what Descartes is doing. And Descartes thinks that the highest form of knowledge requires a kind of certainty, where your degree of belief is maximal and your degree of evidence is maximal. And with this conclusiveness of epistemic reasons in favor of your belief, all possibility of doubt is washed away and ruled out. That's what the highest form of knowledge is. Now, I've been speaking here in terms of this high grade of knowledge, highest form of knowledge, and what I have in mind can be illustrated by thinking about various purchases that you make, like when you sign up for internet access, like with my internet access is through Spectrum. You can purchase the super duper premium internet access or the sort of low budget, low speed stuff. Or with cars, you can buy the high performance automobile or the sort of cheap, uncomfortable, unstylish, underperforming car that kind of gets you from point A to point B. The sort of inexpensive, underperforming car doesn't cease to be a car by being lower quality. Same for internet access. You're still getting internet access when you purchase the low speed stuff. But internet access, cars, and some other things come in different grades. Descartes doesn't say, hey, I think knowledge comes in different kinds, the really super premium kind and the sort of budget kind and the stuff in between. He never actually says that. He just sits down and says, I'm going to talk about the super premium kind of knowledge. That's all he says. And people sort of guess what else he means. Like, does that mean that he thinks that super premium knowledge is the only kind of knowledge? Like, the only knowledge worth calling knowledge is super premium? That's the way he's most commonly interpreted. So most people think that Descartes thought that any kind of knowledge, you don't know anything unless you have total certainty, indubitable, totally conclusive proof. And if you don't have that, you don't have knowledge. I don't believe Descartes actually thought that. I thought that, I think he clearly, I think he believes there's this ordinary sort of, you know, common grade, garden variety knowledge. You know whether you're wearing jogging shoes, boots, flip-flops, or whether your feet are bare at the moment. You can have knowledge of this, but this is garden variety of knowledge. Usually the kind of knowledge we're talking about is garden variety of knowledge. But Descartes also thought, following Aristotle and the medieval commentators on Aristotle, that there was this super duper high grade knowledge. Now, it's most often said that Descartes was an infallibilist about ordinary knowledge. I don't think that's true, but I'm going to stop saying that, stop bringing that up here. Let's just talk about what it means for someone to be an infallibilist in epistemology. Maybe Descartes was, maybe he wasn't. So here's what that means. So suppose you've got some belief, and you're proportioning your degree of belief to the evidence available. So in the chart that we have here, your degree of belief is really pretty strong, and your evidence is pretty strong. You're following the maxim that Locke and Hume, and I believe Descartes also endorsed. So far so good. So your evidence that you possess makes some proposition 95% likely to be true. There's a 95% chance that that proposition is true in light of the evidence that you possess. And so you let your degree of belief be like a 0.95 degree of belief. In other words, where 1 is being totally maximally confident, you couldn't be any more confident. You're about, 95% of that. Okay, so you're following the maxim. Now you've got some pretty good evidence here, right? Your evidence makes the proposition 95%. 95% chance that it's true. The probability is 0.95 that it's true. But even evidence that's pretty strong like that, of course, allows for the possibility that you might be wrong. And we can even say what that possibility is, right? A 95% chance that you're right means there's a 5% chance that you're wrong. So infallibilism about knowledge and epistemology is the view that anything below the maximal threshold regarding evidence is never going to be good enough for knowledge. In order for your knowledge to justify you so strongly that you can be said to really know, your evidence can't fall short of that maximum value. It's got to go all the way to the top. It can't be 95, 97, 99 out of 100. No, there's got to be 100% chance the proposition is true given your evidence in order for you to know that proposition. That's infallibilism. It requires maximal evidence. Only maximal evidence will do for knowledge. You don't have it, you don't have knowledge. Okay, so using the same kind of bar chart, we can easily state what fallibilism about knowledge is in epistemology. And as Stephen Hetherington says in his Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy article, fallibilism is the most common view among epistemologists today. He'll explain why that's the case in just a minute. But fallibilism sets the threshold for knowledge lower. So the difference between this chart and the previous chart is not the height of the blue bar or the height of the red bar. The blue bar and the red bars are both 0.95 out of 100. They both go 95% of the way all the way to the top. So we're imagining someone who has evidence that makes a proposition 95% likely to be true in both cases. But what we're changing is how much is required for knowledge. So that's what threshold is supposed to mean. How much do you have to have for knowledge to know that that proposition is true? Now, in the previous version of the slide, the infallibilist version, the threshold for knowledge, the dotted red, represented by the dotted red line, was all the way at the top, and the red bar fell below that. You needed to have maximal knowledge, you needed to have maximal justification. And the hypothetical person with this belief, this evidence, doesn't have maximal justification. They've got really strong justification. 0.95 degrees strong, but not maximal. The infallibilist looks at that and says, sorry, sucker, your evidence comes up short, you can't know. Now, the fallibilist has a more forgiving view of knowledge. They claim that in order to know, you don't have to have a maximal degree of evidence. Your evidence, your reasons don't have to be absolutely, conclusively, super duper high, super duper strong to know. They have to be pretty strong. So the threshold is now set lower for the fallibilist. And the same person with these 0.95 degree bars now knows according to the fallibilist. They don't know according to infallibilism. They fall short according to infallibilism, but they don't fail to know according to fallibilism. The strength of their evidence crosses the threshold. So infallibilism is the view that in order to know anything, you have to know beyond all possible doubt. The proposition in question that you would like to know needs to be sort of proved or justified by your evidence beyond all possible doubt. Now, the fallibilist can be usefully described in terms of reasonable doubt. Think of the idea from criminal courts of law. So according to fallibilists, you know when your evidence makes it clear that some proposition is true beyond all reasonable doubt. But it's important to appreciate the difference between beyond all possible doubt and beyond all reasonable doubt. If judges were required to convict someone in a criminal case only if the prosecution proved guilt beyond all possible doubt, convictions in criminal cases would be extraordinarily few. There would be zero or, approaching zero convictions. And that's not the standard of proof that we endorse in criminal cases with good reason. We just require that people the prosecution prove their case beyond all reasonable doubt. Okay, so that's fallibilism. The evidence has to make the proposition that you believe probable beyond reasonable doubt, not beyond all possible doubt. And if it does that, then you know. Even though there's a 5% chance that you're wrong, if your evidence, makes it beyond reasonable doubt, you know. So a common thing that's said about infallibilism is that it's too demanding. Its requirements for knowledge are too strict. They rule out too much. I mean, if in order to know something, you've got to meet this super high bar, how much are you going to know? There's very few things that can meet this super high bar. There are some things. Descartes' most famous for pointing out the first thing you should realize that satisfies the infallibilist criterion, and that's your belief that you exist. It should be totally beyond all possible doubt to you that you exist. You shouldn't just say to yourself, yeah, I guess I exist. No, it's totally clear that you do. You couldn't be mistaken about that. Descartes begins there. A lot of people think that maybe Descartes ends there. There's much more to Descartes than that. He wants to go on to argue that maybe a lot of things we'd like to believe that can actually satisfy the infallibilist criterion for knowledge. But that was his most famous case. Without getting into how Descartes thought we have a whole lot of other beliefs that could potentially satisfy the infallibilist criterion, The main thing that I just want to focus on right now is just that the usual way of understanding fallibilism is that it leads to something like skepticism, a near skepticism, if not a total skepticism. So for purposes of this course, by skepticism I mean the view that you don't have any knowledge of the external world, the world external to your mind. The reason why in epistemology and philosophy, history of philosophy generally, we talk about skepticism about the external world as opposed to just skepticism, period, is that, at least in the West, Descartes and others thought that you could be totally certain what's in your mind, but you should probably, when it comes to things outside your mind, it seems like you're going to have a whole lot less certainty about those things. You can know it, how things seem, how things appear to you in your mind. But do those appearances actually match up with reality external to your mind? Well, that's doubtful. It's beyond doubt that things appear to you a certain way, but it's doubtful that maybe things are in fact that way. In any case, this distinction between appearance and reality is the reason why we talk about knowledge of the external world, or skepticism about the external world. Because for the most part, we're allowing that skepticism doesn't apply to your inner world. I think it does apply to your inner world, but I'm just not going to get into that because it clearly applies to the external world. Okay, so in any case, if infallibilism is true, you don't have much knowledge. And if fallibilism is true, then you have a good bit of knowledge because it offers a less demanding, more forgiving analysis of the requirements for knowledge. So a lot of epistemologists, a lot of philosophers have been drawn to fallibilism over the years because it just seems intuitively true to them that we do have a good bit of knowledge. It just seems, philosophers ask themselves, what is more plausible, that we have basically zero knowledge of the external world, or that we know a good number of things about the external world? And most philosophers, it's the thing that people say is that most philosophers think that we know a good bit about the external world. That's actually, in fact, more doubtful than people make it seem. Plato was more of a skeptic than people think. Kant and all the Germans philosophers and most French philosophers that followed Kant in Europe didn't seem to think that it was most clearly, intuitively plausible that we know lots of stuff. But in any case, the sort of cliche that you hear is that most philosophers find fallibilism more plausible than infallibilism. Now, regardless of how many philosophers over the years have actually thought fallibilism is the most plausible view, if anyone wants to be a fallibilist, philosopher or otherwise, there's some questions they need to answer. What's the threshold for knowledge? How much evidence do you actually have to have? I think they should, fallibilists should refuse to put a number on it, and they should follow my suggestion earlier in terms of using qualitative terms, beyond all reasonable doubt versus beyond all possible doubt. They should use terms like this to describe strength of knowledge. And if someone wants to ask, does that mean your evidence should make it 95% likely that the proposition in question is true, or 99? I think they should avoid the quantitative question and speak in qualitative fashion. But a more serious problem for the skepticism, a more serious question, a more challenging question for the fallibilist concerns skepticism. It seems that fallibilism, because it allows you to know stuff without having totally conclusive justification, your less than totally conclusive justification allows that a radical form of skepticism might be true. Seems that the fallibilist should be saying things like this. I believe I gave you a statement evaluation assignment with this particular kind of statement on it. At least I certainly meant to. Oh, surely I did. I know I have two hands, but I might be wrong. I know I have two hands, but there's a 5% chance I'm wrong and I don't have two hands. Ask yourself how those two kinds of statements sound. Those are statements of fallibilism. Those are statements that fallibilists say. Knowledge doesn't require certainty. You can know when there is a chance that you might be wrong. So even though fallibilism sort of initially sounds good to lots of people, they're like, oh, more forgiving standards? That sounds very nice and attractive. At least that seems the way it goes for a lot of people. But then when you say things like what I have here at the bottom of the screen, fallible sorts of things that you ought to be able to say, I mean, these are totally fine things to say according to fallibilists. But to many people's ears, these do not sound totally okay and totally fine. I mean, there's something, a lot of people think there's something wrong about that. I know. I don't just believe, I know I have two hands. But I might be wrong. I mean, if you might, a lot of people think that if you might be wrong, then you don't know. If there's a 5% chance that you're wrong, you don't know. In any case, you have to decide what you think. If you think a chance of being wrong rules out knowledge, then you're thinking like an infallibilist. And it might lead to skepticism. You might say, well, okay, so what then? I guess skepticism is true. We're going to talk more about skepticism and how fallibilists have tried to sort of avoid falling into skepticism in my next presentation. This is the banner that's hanging over my bed. But it can be challenging to see how to avoid skepticism. I said earlier that infallibilism seems to lead to skepticism because so very few of our beliefs satisfy the stringent criteria laid down by skepticism. That means we basically don't know anything, which is basically what skepticism says. You don't know really anything. So infallibilism seems to lead to skepticism. But infallibilism doesn't seem to rule out skepticism. It seems to allow for its possibility. According to fallibilism, you can have your fallibly justified beliefs, but for all you fallibly justifiably believe, you could be a brain in a vat and reality with no arms, no legs, no apartment, no car, no UB campus that you thought you used to go to before the pandemic. You're just a brain floating in a vat of nutrients with electrodes hooked up to you, your cerebral cortex. And through those electrodes, your cortex is being stimulated by a supercomputer, making it seem like you've got arms and legs and an apartment and car and a friend and a campus to go to. When in fact, none of that's true. Because fallibilist justification is less than maximal, it allows that this is totally possible. But if it allows that it's totally possible, then, I mean, how can we be in a position to know that's not us? So for both fallibilism and infallibilism, there's this skeptical challenge that we're going to have to face up to that I'll talk about more in our next video presentation.